So welcome to the last day of Driven 2020. Again, this has been 5 days of some of the best minds in automation, talking about the 5 key themes we see in the automation market: artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, general process automation, application modernization, and finally, enterprise user experience design. Whatever is required, we'll help you find a faster way to get to your business outcome. And we're ready to start day 5, focused on enterprise user experience and design. Look, design impacts everything we do in life, just like process. And we are attempting to have design affect everything we do at BP3 in much the same way that process impacts everything we do here. And if you haven't had a chance to work with our design team yet on an engagement, right, you're really missing out. These guys are amazing to work with. There is an art to combining the needs of the enterprise with the needs of design and the benefits of design. And it's not easy, but this team has really, I think, found the way to make it work. And we're going to share as much as we can with you today, but bear in mind it's only 2 hours. And if you really want to learn and experience this, the best way is to experience it, right? Just work with this team and experience what it's like to go through the process. And I think you'll love it. So let me turn it over to Andy Basiri, who is hosting our last but not least sessions today on user experience and design. Thank you, Andy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Krista. I'm really excited to be here. Let's kick this thing off. I'm going to move pretty fast. I have a lot that I want to talk about today, and I hope that it's entertaining for you all. You should see this enterprise user experience screen. Is that right, Krista? All right. Okay, cool. Well, let's get started. So my name is Andy Basiri. I'm the Director of Design here at BP3, and I'm really excited to talk about UX today. So first, a little bit about me. I've been working in design for about 15 years in multiple industries. I specialize in helping clients design large-scale, complex enterprise applications. I'm an expert interaction designer, sprint facilitator, and while at BP3 for the last 4 years, I've done a lot of amazing work with our clients to design custom solutions for things like dialysis care or telecom, construction management, even some stuff for hospitality, cruise lines, stuff like that. You might have heard about some of that yesterday. And most recently, I've been helping customers as a certified sprint facilitator and designer to catalyze product-led operational transformation. So we're going to talk about that. So we're going to go through, I think it's really important because we hear this a lot when we're talking about UX is UI, right? So what's the difference between UX and UI? Just to clarify, because it's going to be important as we go. We're going to talk with my friend John Morcus. He's one of our partners about UX maturity, and that should be fun. We're going to talk about design process and principles, UX impact with my friend Nick Loining at Essentia Health. We're going to talk about bringing that all together and how that maximizes ROI. And then we're going to talk to some of our engineers about the value from their perspective of UX. And then we'll have some time for questions. So first off, UX and UI are not the same thing. All right, so let's get into this. So, like this, you can kind of think about the way people think about UX is kind of like UI is this top part of the iceberg here, right? But really, in order to talk about UX, I think we need to talk about design thinking. So then you understand holistically what we're talking about. And this is even when we talk about design thinking, this is how people think about it. But in order to understand that, we need to kind of talk about what it is. So I like this definition from Tim Brown, who wrote the book Change by Design. And he said, design thinking in business uses the designer's sensibility and methods to match people's needs with what is technologically feasible and what a viable business strategy can convert into customer value and market opportunity. So what does that mean? So we'll talk about a little bit about that. So I think the way that people typically think about design thinking and design, work is that design thinking is purely just for the designers, right? We have these siloed mentality about business, design, and tech, but really how we want to think about it is how do we bring these things together? Our goal is to align business needs, right, the need to generate revenue, with human needs, right, so it solves a problem for a person or even the business by way of the person, right, because that's how we deliver business value, and technical requirements. Is it feasible? Is it reliable? To create something that brings all of that into focus by meeting the needs of its users, is technologically feasible, and generates value. Now, I like this quote about design thinking from Fast Company, and basically it just says, it's a proven and repeatable problem-solving protocol. It's a process, right? And we love processes here at BP3, right? So the way design thinking materializes as a process, because not only is it a philosophy, a way of thinking, a way of doing, it's also a process. And there's many flavors of this now. You'll see a lot of this happening now, proliferating. But at this point, I think that people treat design thinking like it's old hat, right? But it's really like the foundational differentiating methodology and process that I think successful business teams, product teams use today. And there's 6 phases of that. First is empathize, like this idea, and this is a graphic from Nielsen Norman Group, right? So this is where we collect data and understand our business space, our problem space, our users, all that. Then we define, we go through that data and we figure out what we can actually do, what problems there are. We ideate on those problems, we prototype, right, creating something testable. Then we test it. This is how we get data to understand if our design meets user needs. And then we implement it, right? So we'll get more into that and about kind of like our process for product development. But the thought, even though we conceptualize it as a process, as circular, right, because it's iterative, sometimes it's going to look something like this. I like to say it feels like this. It's kind of all over the place, but really the important thing to remember is that you're using what you learn in every phase to inform the next. So this structure gives us a means by which we can deliver creative solutions because we can learn by doing, and we can use that to expand our understanding and view of how to build the right solution. So now from like a product design and development perspective, this is incomplete, and we'll talk more about that later. So let's shelf that for a moment. So what is UX? UX, user experience, is a person's perceptions and responses resulting from or anticipated use and anticipated use of a product, system, or service. So there's a lot of things that can contribute to that, right? A person's experience is a consequence of things like branding, presentation, functionality, performance, and even just like a user's internal state, like resulting from, let's say, like prior experiences, their attitudes, their skills, their personality, and really the context of use, and more importantly, their goals, like what are they trying to accomplish? So the mission of UX designers is to study the needs, wants, and goals, the motivations, the mental models, the attitudes, the environment, etc., right? All this stuff of users in order to create things that are viable, things that are usable, things that are useful is really important. You know, like these are really the dimensions that we measure something that that creates a good user experience. And some techniques we use to get those designs are things like design sprints, right? Design sprints are a kind of workshop. It's like a 5-day workshop. We use workshops, rapid prototyping, card sorting, heuristic evaluation, and then design research, like interviews, observational studies, stuff like that. So these are just a few ways we can develop the foresight, really, to understand what needs to be designed and how designs might work to be received when implemented, right? So what that person's experience is going to be. So this diagram kind of shows the spectrum of things that encompass or affect user experience. You can see here, there's a lot on here, right? But they still cover those 3 foundational areas we talked about, which is design, business, and technology, right? And that's all those things coming together is the user experience. So you can see here, marketing, back-end processes, performance, information architecture, style guides, surface design. And here you can see that user interfaces are just like a small part of what makes the user experience. So then, what is UI? UI is merely the interactive presentation layer of the product. And it shouldn't be discounted at the level of impact a UI can have on user experience. The skills that it takes to produce great user interfaces, you know, just can't be understated. And you can see here, there's a lot of things that go into that. There's also something called Gestalt principles, which is kind of the psychology of how we perceive space and information and group information, right? So there's a lot of things at play here. But the reason UX, design thinking, research, prototyping, testing, all that, the reason it's important is because what users want and need don't always match what we expect or what we design for that matter. And that mismatch could have serious consequences, all right? So for example, you can see there's this, it looks like a Twitter post here. So I don't know if you all remember this, in 2018, I believe it was. Yeah, there was that alarm that went out in Hawaii about a missile attack, right? and it created a lot of panic. And this is actually the UI for that. They look like link buttons, right? So when you look at this, you're just like, well, these aren't buttons. Surely I click on this and it goes somewhere new. And like, no, this actually activated that system. Another example from the book, Tragic Design, is actually this one back here, you can see, where a young cancer patient actually died from toxicity because nurses couldn't see the critical alerts that were important for her care that would have prevented her death. So now, it doesn't have to be this extreme, but bad UX can generate poor outcomes for the people who experience it, and more importantly, for the people that we're talking to today, for your business, right? It can mean poor outcomes. So while rationally thinking, this design makes sense, right? Like you might perceive it as this design makes sense. The reality is that designs can be easy to rationalize depending on your point of view and the knowledge you already have. However, from like a rational point of view, behavior isn't always predictable because behavior is oftentimes by measure irrational. There are a lot of psychological principles at play when it comes to how people make decisions and value judgments. And these have consequences for the things we design. We learn a lot about this through behavioral economists like Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, Dan Ariely, Barry Schwartz. And the psychological concepts might be things like choice overload, anchoring, loss aversion, right? And despite really the title here you can see of Dan Ariely's book, Particularly Irrational, these effects aren't always easily predictable when designing complex solutions. And that's why we base our design on things like this: business goals, design best practice, user goals, needs, and wants, right, which requires research. Business stakeholder and user feedback, technical requirements and constraints, research, right? Research to understand and validate our solution is being used and has the desired effect we intend it to have. You know, is it useful? Is it desirable? Is it usable? So which in turn allows us to design exceptional user experiences. And a great user experience includes functionality and data and content, right, that provide business value. They're easy for users to figure out. They help people do their tasks or meet their goals, efficiencies, and you know, importantly, also people like using it. And when you create a good user experience, you generate good outcomes for your business, right? We've seen successes like fewer user errors, user efficiency, lower training costs, lower support costs, less rework from development, and higher employee retention. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in order to really talk about like what this means in terms of like your business structure, we're going to talk, I'm going to talk with my friend, John Morcus. He's here. Hey, John.
Hey, everybody. How are you doing, Andy?
Awesome. I'm glad you're here. John is one of our partners. John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm happy to be part of Driven this year. I've been doing UX for about 20 years or so. Started out as a UX researcher, but then got into managing UX design teams as well. I've known folks from BP3 for about 20 years from other companies where we've worked. And I've been lucky enough to work with Andy on some projects. Andy, I will never match your energy level. There's just no way in this talk, probably or ever. So just be prepared for that. But I'll try to be smart, at least.
No doubt. I know you will. Which is why you're here. We love working with John. And so this was something that you and I discussed is, really, how do we know where people are in terms of their maturity, and where they, and how can we get them to where they want to be? So why don't you take us through this, and we'll kind of talk about it as we go.
Sure. So it's really important for companies to understand where they are in terms of UX maturity, because you want to know what you're doing right and what you could do better, right? To get the most value out of your user experience resources and activities. You want to get the most business value. You don't want to be leaving money on the table. So really, a lot of this is about making money and saving money, and UX can do a lot to help you do those things. So at the bottom of this ladder here, we have unaware, and these are companies that generally don't know much about UX or really aren't focused on it, going all the way up to strategic. And so we're going to go through briefly each one of these.
Yeah, let's jump into it. So tell me about companies that are unaware.
Yeah, so for the unaware phase, and maybe some of us have worked in those companies, I know I have. At first, a lot of startups start out this way, where they might have a great algorithm or some great functionality that nobody else has. And so they're really focused on just building out that technology, getting it out into the marketplace, and they're not so focused on providing a great user experience if there is a front end to it. And so that means that they don't have business goals defined that relate to UX, or they're not recognizing that UX is important. They're not really focused on what users might need or want. The approach really is, we're going to build this and we're going to tell people how to, just to use it, and they'll figure out how to use it because it's so great. The UI development is usually an afterthought. So it's not like they have somebody assigned in the beginning who's going to really focus on UX throughout the process. It's more like, okay, now we have to put a UI on this, and it's usually done at the end, and who's available to do it. It might not be anybody with UX or UI development skills. And the assumption then is that that person is going to design the UI in ways that make sense to that person, right? So the developer who implements it gets to decide what the user experience is going to be, and that developer builds it basically for himself or herself. And that's not great.
And we also, that's like the one size fits all, huh?
Yeah, we also have this problem where there's only one user basically that it's designed for, right? It's not for different roles. It's not taking into account different wants and needs from different types of users.
So like from an enterprise UX perspective, what kind of impact do you think that has on internally, like operationally, the business itself?
So it really depends on the kind of solution this is or system this is. But many times, if there's a front end to it, there are some UI components and UX components that are important, right? And if you don't meet those basic needs that users have and those expectations that have been set now by use of smartphones and tablets and all that for many years, you're really potentially losing out on adoption. You're losing out on usability, which means that people aren't going to get their tasks done efficiently. They're less likely to recommend this to other people, right? So they're not going to get their tasks done, as you mentioned, as one of the goals for UX.
Okay. So let's talk more about, let's go to the next level, aware.
Yeah, and so some of those problems emerge, right? So it's out there getting used or not used by people. The company that built it says, oh, what's going on? Our adoption is low. Right. People are calling support. They have a lot of questions on how to do things and why isn't it obvious, right? And so customers complain, and then that's when leadership says, okay, we really need to do something. We're losing money here. We're not going to get the renewals. We're not going to get the licenses or sales. And so at this point, people start collecting usability issues that they're aware of. And, they're also hearing things like, well, we have different roles that you're not addressing, right? It's a one-size-fits-all situation. We have approvers for certain tasks, right? People who need to submit things to be approved, and you're not representing that, for example. And so this lack of UX focus becomes really obvious to people. And at this point, people are trying to figure out what to do next.
And is there a higher dependency on training in companies like this?
Yeah, so a lot of times in the kind of unaware stage, companies aren't even really thinking about how to roll this out, right?
Right.
So there isn't real good training available. There isn't a plan to do beta testing and collect UX feedback from those users along the way, and then adjust, fix things before it's fully deployed. So that is a big problem, and that can hurt adoption, that can leave money on the table and all that as well.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about engage. What makes a company engage with UX?
So once companies are aware and they know they have a problem, it's like okay, we need to throw some UX love at this, or they might call it UI love still, right? So we need somebody to come in, and they might go out and hire somebody to work on fixing these usability problems, to throw some UX or UI magic at this. And one thing to be careful of in this point is, if you're doing enterprise UX, you're probably working on a complicated system, maybe with lots of data, complicated processes and tasks for the users, probably different user roles. You want to make sure that you get the right person or people involved to do the UX with you, and that you don't just go out and grab a web designer, a random web designer, somebody who's done like simple websites, or a graphic designer who makes things look pretty, right? You don't want to go off and grab that wrong person and then expect that person to understand even the problems that you're trying to solve. So be careful about that.
Certainly been the case in projects that you and I have worked on, where they're really just complex, data-heavy enterprise solutions.
Right. And we've often come in and we've tried to fix things that other people have tried to do initially. And it turned out that they didn't have the right background or even interest sometimes in tackling those kinds of problems. So also in this phase where people are engaged now and trying to solve their UX problem, they start to do a little bit of research where they look internally, right? So they might create some wireframes, some early design prototypes, and they might realize, okay, well, let's get some feedback. But the issue is that they go internal. So they'll go to subject matter experts, or they'll go to managers who used to be in that user role many years ago. And they'll say, what do you think about this? Or what do you think the requirements are? And this is better than nothing, right? But be careful with that, because you're leaving a lot of important data to the side. And that is data from target users, from actual users that you care about. And then also at this stage, people recognize, okay, well, we do have multiple user types and they're different. And so they don't really understand at this stage what those differences are, but at least they recognize that they're going to have different users.
And going back to the SMEs and managers, I think one thing I remember you said to me, which really made me laugh and stuck with me, is, yeah, that person might have done that job, but they haven't done it since the Clinton administration, which really gives you perspective about how long ago that might have been and how much things might have changed, not only with the job, but also their personal goals and priorities.
Right. I mean, there could be even a generational difference, right, in people's expectations. People who grew up with, all the technology that young people have today versus people like me who, learned how to type in high school on a typewriter, right? Very different.
Right. So, yeah.
At this stage, also, we see some collaboration between the designer and developers. So designers probably creating mock-ups or prototypes and then showing them to developers or handing them off to developers for implementation. So it's still kind of early stage compared to the process that you were talking about. And this whole thing, by the way, is hard to do, right? As Scott mentioned in the beginning, this is not easy to just go and do a great UX from the start. It takes time, experience, trial and error, all that kind of stuff. And then also on this stage, they're really not focused too much on measuring the outcomes. They're not measuring things like usability or user adoption in the right way. They're not looking at opportunities to find where UX can add value and then measure to make sure that you're on track to get there before you actually deploy it.
Okay, so this is kind of like this is the it's better than nothing phase.
It's better than nothing.
All right, so integrated. That sounds nice.
So things are getting better all the time here, right? So at this point, that in that last stage, that one UX person resulted in some improvements, right? So fewer complaints and better usability, and it probably looks better and all that, and that's great. And so the company says, okay, let's get some more UX people on projects, and that's a very good thing, right? And then there's a little bit more process, something that looks closer to what you described, Andy, where there's iteration, right, between UX and development people. At this stage also, typically, they recognize, okay, front-end development is a skill in itself, right? If you want somebody to know, like if you're going to use Angular material, you need somebody who knows what that is and can learn it, right? And you can't just throw any old full-stack developer or back-end developer especially at this problem and have them figure it out at the very end. So this is starting to be valued now as a skill that the team needs. Product management and UX design should be working really closely. They should be best friends. And at this stage, they're starting to work more closely, and they're doing stuff that's informed by data from UX research, which includes user studies, right? So we're getting information about requirements and feedback from target users that we care about. So people who match the personas that we're starting to identify.
So in your experience, do companies at this stage usually have any kind of structured product management?
Some do and some don't. So sometimes it's just a subject matter expert who might be put in that role of product manager, and that person's responsible for requirements and making decisions about what's in and what's out and how things should work. But the more enlightened companies realize that you can't just take a subject matter expert and have them read some blogs or a book or whatever and make them a product manager. That it takes time, it takes training, and a lot of times you might be better off with a product manager who doesn't know your discipline coming in and then learning your discipline, right? Somebody with product management experience.
Right.
Or pairing that person with subject matter experts, and they can all work together and figure it out. So another thing that happens at this stage is that some of the goals that you were talking about, Andy, they finally have UX metrics attached to them. So you mentioned something about value of functionality and data and content. I think that those were the words that you used. We can actually measure that, and along the way of creating prototypes, and before it's fully deployed, we can measure how valuable people think certain functionality is, right? By asking them. And then once it's out there, it's not a surprise. You can predict really well how it will be received by measuring this early on and then along the way during the design and development stages.
That's great. Okay. So then leveling up, like this I would think is really where people want to be right here.
Yeah, I mean, the last two, this one and the next one, this is where you want to be. So for this one, we have UX metrics really guiding teams' work, right? So if user adoption is important for us to make money, keep our customers happy, then we have user metrics around UX metrics around that will help us know ahead of time whether we're on track. We also have UX people deployed appropriately on the different teams. It doesn't mean that every team has a whole bunch of UX people. It just means that when UX is needed, when you need to address it, there are people with the right skills who are available to work on it. And they're working on multidisciplinary teams with product managers and front-end developers and back-end developers, and all the skills that you need are there. We also, at this point, have a UX design that serves as the spec for implementation. So it's not an optional suggestion kind of thing. Okay. It's a situation where you have good UX people who know what they're doing and they're doing a good process along with other people on the team. And everyone recognizes that the design that is quote unquote final for a particular release is the spec, and that's what gets implemented. And there needs to be a good reason for deviating from that design if you're a developer. So
it sounds like there's a lot more trust in the product that UX is delivering and the work that they're doing.
There's a lot more trust, and there is good collaboration as well throughout the process. So it's not a surprise when that final spec is delivered. if you had issues or questions earlier, it's all been worked out with the team. Also, UX research is happening. So like I said, you could do research to find out what functionality, for example, is valuable, right? You can just ask, how valuable is this tab design approach to you from 0 to 10, right? Versus another approach. And users will tell you, and then you can find an average score and figure out if it's 9 out of 10 from everybody, then great. That's probably a good design solution, right? And then later in the process, we have other techniques that we can bring to bear to test usability. We could do surveys that are qualitative to help you understand why something's important or why something should work a certain way. And then
I'm hearing a lot of data. There's a lot of data supporting the design.
Right. It's not just one thing. It's not just like a feedback form in your screen, right, where people can just type, you know, whatever, I don't like it. Or it's not like a survey with one question, right? And then at this point also, a lot of times companies will have a design system in place or a pattern library. They'll have design style guides. And the best companies will pair it with a component library that developers created so that it's really easy for design and prototyping to just pull from this library. You get consistent designs. It's good for user expectations. They're familiar with it. It's presented consistently. And we have code that works, hopefully. And it can be, the best ones are kind of production ready code or almost ready code.
Right, things that are highly reusable and allow our process to be even more agile.
Right, so think like tables, right? How are we going to do tables? How are we going to do buttons? And some other things like that.
Right, and reusing those over and over again. That's awesome. And so really, so then this is like the creme de la creme of like UX maturity. And why is that? Why is this where people really want to get to?
I mean, this is hard to get to, but some companies do make it. I've worked with companies that are here, right? And at this stage, the strategic stage, you're getting the full value out of your UX team, right? And you're maximizing the user experience for your users so that they're able to do their tasks. It's easy and efficient for them. They like it. They like it to the point that they will be your big fans and they will be recommending you to other companies. And there's a whole understanding of the importance of user experience throughout the organization. So, you know, whether you're a developer or a doc writer or product manager or, you know, even, you know, anybody in the company, marketing, everybody understands why it's important. And these are the companies where somebody proposes an idea and somebody else will say, well, what will our users think about that idea? You know, let's go find out. Or do we know already? Right. And this is if you're a UX person, this is like the great place to be because you can actually hold up a release if there's an issue that is going to prevent you from meeting your goals. Right?
Wouldn't that be nice?
So wouldn't that be great? And this happens where you can say, okay, if we implement it that way that you're proposing, our adoption will suffer or it'll be impossible for them to complete this critical task, right? And then in this strategic phase also, you know, everything is staffed appropriately. So if you need an interaction designer or a visual designer, et cetera, you have access to all those folks. They're embedded in the teams.
You're having the right people.
Yeah, and then also UX has a seat at the table in terms of defining the goals for the company. So if you're a company that has a front end and it's important, then UX is there and they're helping figure out, okay, you want to have a world-class user experience. And this is something, Andy, that a client of ours said to us not that long ago. And we're like, that sounds great, right? What does that mean? And we'll help you define what that means and then how we can measure it so you can see whether we're on track. And then outcomes are continuously measured against the goals.
So I think what I hear here, I mean, in the last section, we talked a lot about data being informed. And I think when I hear this, when I think about strategic companies, I think there's more questions than there are answers. People are always willing to embrace the questions and the ambiguity, and there's a willingness and process usually to navigate that ambiguity to get the information required with an understanding that that information can also change.
And working through that is just normal. It's just part of the process. And you end up where you need to be, right? So doing all of this means that you're reducing the risk of building the wrong thing. You're saving money. You're not going out and building the wrong thing. And then you have this terrible question of, are we going to live with this? Are we going to redo this?
Right.
Or are we going to go back to the legacy thing that we've been using and just be stuck, right? So this process and this focus on UX will help you avoid that problem.
So guys, we have some really good questions that have come into the chat. So
okay, before we answer them, do you want to start a poll and then we can answer them while people answer the poll?
That sounds good. We'll go ahead and launch this poll. And so the first question is, how do I sell the idea that design is important to my company?
All right. Oh God. Okay. Well, I mean, in my experience, I think it's about just showing people the value over time. It's trying to adopt little practices here and there, and kind of holding firm and having a design process that you trust, and trying to kind of bring people in there whenever you can, and then showing them the value by saying, you know, it's a lot of perseverance. I don't know, John, what would you say about that?
I think that's great, but I would also, at the same time, I would point to the pain, right? So there's value, and then the flip side is, what are we losing right now? Is it, you know, people don't want to use our app, people don't want to recommend us for sales because our app is terrible, or, you know, what is the issue that UX is going to solve, UX team is going to solve for this company, and point that out, and then show the value by saying, okay, if we do these things based on other projects we've done, or, you know, things that I'm aware of, I think that we're going to be able to increase adoption by 5%, 10%. And what does that look like? How many dollars does that amount to? Or we're going to save on support costs, right? If we fix this one big problem, we're going to get fewer support calls. And what does each call cost us, right? Try to attach dollars to it. And then slowly, like step by step, baby steps, we always say, try to show the value, show, you know, improvement, and then you'll get buy-in. I mean, I've worked on projects where it's like a switch, right? All of a sudden, people love UX and they all want it, and then you're like, oh, we don't have enough people, right?
Right. And I think we worked on a project like that where there was a lot of, you know, blocking access to users, and just, you know, I think I remember in the last project we worked on, you know, the project lead basically just said, well, it's just a database and some maintenance screens, right? What's the problem? Yeah. And then, you know, without that access to users, you know, but then once we finally got the access to users, it's like the light bulb came on, right? And then everyone was like, oh, we want to do this more. We want to get this data more.
Right. You take that user input and stakeholder input, put it together, and you make good decisions about what to do. You can't have just one side or the other side. You really need both.
Were there more questions?
Yes, there are more questions, so we need to move a little bit faster through them, but we'll go ahead and share the poll results. So it looks like most of the people, 44%, said that they are in that middle stage of engaged.
Yeah, right.
One of the questions that relates to this is, how big are these organizations at each of these stages? And I guess specifically, are you looking at, when you get up to strategic, you have to be a Fortune 100 company, or can small companies be strategic with their design? And then how big are those UX teams that you said are fully staffed, which if I ever work at a company where any department is fully staffed, is going to be just amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a lot of, those are a lot of good companies. So, so engaged here, 44%, that makes sense to me. I mean, I would have guessed that. Most companies would be in the middle. I have worked with small companies and large companies that are unaware, and I've worked with small and large companies that are strategic. So I don't know that company size matters so much. It's probably easier to be strategic if you're actually a small company, because your focus is more limited. There are fewer people that you need to educate and bring on board. But as you grow, good luck keeping that strategic focus, right? Andy, what were you going to say?
I think I was going to say the same thing. I mean, being strategic, basically, the point there is that And we're going to talk about what that looks like in this next section here, and kind of what the ingredients of that are. But that basically just means you're being really focused and goal-oriented. And so the size doesn't matter there. The UX team size could, I would say, is more dependent on the complexity of the problems you're solving, one,
Right.
and the size of the kind of number of streams or problems you're trying to solve at once. I mean, that's why, companies like, Google and Apple have huge UX teams, whereas, smaller product companies don't necessarily need that, because, they can have a UX designer that is also good enough at research. But once that product, kind of reaches a new level and you're reaching more users, there's only so many things that one person can design and test at one time. Right. And if your development team grows, and I think I've heard the rule of thumb is you should have one designer for every 4 developers. And that's kind of just more of a throughput problem, is how much design work can be created that 4 developers can work on. Otherwise, you're going to have a throughput issue.
I used to answer that question with a number, and I don't anymore, because it depends on so many variables. Like, we'd be happy to talk to people offline afterwards and try to give you some more guidance on that one, but that's a very tricky one.
Well, we'll probably put that one over in the Driven Slack organization so that everybody can kind of chime in. And don't forget the Driven Slack organization, a link is at the top of the chat. So we'll just do one more question because we have more questions coming in at a very rapid pace. So how do you get cultural support of UX? Do you recommend building a UX COE? We have a comment from one of my favorite attendees. She's been here all 5 days. I see recently many companies started their own separate enterprise level UX teams for specific enterprise level standard designs. So is that something that you guys would recommend, starting these COEs or these enterprise teams?
I mean, I think, I've seen a lot of, there's a lot of ways to structure design teams. And design is still a relatively newly, in relation to how old the UX discipline is, it's still evolving in terms of, operations. How should UX fit into operations? I think the best thing I've seen is like a mixed strategy between some kind of centralized UX operation and a UX operation where you have UX people kind of placed in teams. And I think the reason that is because, to me, and I think you can tell from that section before, is UX and product thinking and design thinking. It's all really a UX designer is someone who's not just like trying to figure out how the thing should work. It's really, you want UX kind of imbued into everyone's thinking, but the UX designer specifically is focused on solving solution-oriented problems. But not every company has that. So it's hard to do. The cultural change is probably the hardest. And I think that's because it's not tech culture, it's work culture. Work culture is very broken. And there's ways of mitigating that. And I think UX, in my experience, UX designers, like facilitators, have the best skills in order to mitigate those things because they know how to reduce the conversations and navigate around politics. So the cultural part is really difficult. And I actually even point that out later. But I would say that organizationally, I think that embedding UX designers in multidisciplinary teams is probably the best first step.
And taking baby steps and working on the most valuable, most critical projects to shine a light on what UX is capable of doing, that helps a lot. That helps change the culture. Because if you're in there, if you're one of the people helping the company make money, save money, and people know about it, they're going to want more of what you're doing, right? So that alone will help you out. I don't know whether it needs to be a COE, possibly, if that helps you get to where you need to be, but doing actual work goes a long way.
Great. All right. Well, all right, let's move forward. John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here. We love working with you. And thanks for sharing your experience with us.
Sure, I love working with BP3 too. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks, John.
Hi, John.
All right, so let's talk about this. This is great. This is a great segue. So what are the product design strategies that set mature companies apart? And basically, in my perspective, allow them to outpace competitors. So let's talk about that. Come on, there we go. All right, so these are what I would say are the ingredients for successful product design. And we're gonna go into each of these is alignment on strategy, buy-in on processes, and a supportive culture, which I just said is probably the most difficult one. So what is your strategy? So in 2018, we worked with a large hospitality and travel company that was modernizing. And when the project started, I remember the client kept saying, our goal is to replace the legacy software, which in this case was a reservation management platform. And finally, I just asked the questions. Well, what changes are you trying to realize by replacing the software? And this is the what are your strategy? What is your strategy? What are your goals? That's that question, right? And so believe it or not, this is actually a problem that a lot of clients are dealing with. And I think it's because it's easier for people to focus on what they think a solution should be rather than why they need a solution. And so when asked, they couldn't actually articulate a meaningful strategy and goals, even though they had a really strong narrative of the need for modernization. And that isn't to say at all that the legacy system wasn't causing problems, right? I'm not gonna be that guy, don't nail it to the wall. But modernization is important. What we see a lot of the times, and I'm sure you've heard about this all this week, is that these legacy systems created like a bloated workforce. In this example, for this client, is they had a bloated workforce that required them to deal with system limitations, right? Like someone's job who literally was to take documents from this part of the organization and then reformat them so they can upload them as a CSV, right? That's the kind of things we're dealing with. Heavy reliance on IT, high licensing fees, right? All this like severely limits business capability. But when your strategy is replacing software, you're just putting lipstick on a pig, okay? Replacing software often becomes rebuilding it. Continuing to inherit legacy models of working or maintaining the status quo. And I'll get into this later, but like literally all the requirements become, I need to be able to do all the things I did before in the legacy system. So all the requirements are based on what they already have. So you're really just maintaining status quo there. Replacing often means inheriting the constraints of the previous system in that case. And then so what happens is the business continues to serve the system rather than the system serving the business. And so, so again, what is your strategy? And I like this, this quote from Stephen Bungay, and he says, strategy is a deployable decision-making framework enabling action to achieve desired outcomes, constrained by current capabilities, coherently aligned to existing context, which is like, right? But I just keep bringing it back to this. It's a proven and repeatable problem-solving protocol. You're gonna see this slide a couple more times. I really like how writer Melissa Perry, she wrote the book, The Build Trap, which is a great book. She simplifies that by saying, strategy is a framework that allows me to figure out where I am now, where I want to go, and how to align those two things. So at BP3, we like to start with a goal alignments workshop. And this is where we have leadership define the vision for where they want to be in 5 years, right? And then next, we call out the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that are impacting their ability to get to where they want to be. And then we form some kind of short-term SMART goals for the business units and product teams that we believe will help us move us towards our vision today. And this, I really want you to understand how important goals really are, because this is so important, and there's some science to this. So goals affect how we perceive the world around us, because we actually perceive a world of tools and obstacles based on subjective context. And you'll kind of understand that here in this next example. We also see the world as what matters, right? And irrelevance is based on what we've learned to ignore, right? Because it's neither a tool nor an obstacle in that specific context. An example from Professor of Psychology, Dr. Jordan Peterson, he says, imagine I'm late for class and there's this recycling bin in the way. I'm gonna have this like immediate emotional reaction, you know, like, what idiot put this here, you know, because in that moment, it's not a recycling bin, it's an obstacle. And it's an obstacle to my current goal of getting to class. If it's not in my way, well, then it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to my goal. So now pay attention to this video.
The players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Did you see the gorilla? Right, here we go. This is interesting, right? So looks like 83% saw the gorilla. Some people didn't. All right, so originally, in this famous experiment, this is actually an experiment by Daniel Simmons, and it was later named the invisible gorilla. And only half of people saw the gorilla. About 90% of people believe they would see or notice something that's important or distinctive or unusual come into their field of view. Later, eye tracking studies that they did on this same experiment showed that people who missed the gorilla looked at it for up to a second. All right, looks like we have 74-26 split. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Andy, I would say Zoom might have messed you up a little bit there with its video lag, but overall, I think that you had a lot of people not see that gorilla. So
yeah,
we did get.
So go ahead.
We did get some good questions in the chat for you before you go any further. One of them is how are goal alignment workshops working during the pandemic? How are people able to get their goals aligned during a pandemic?
So we run virtual workshops, just like we run virtual design sprints. We use tools like Zoom, we use tools like Mural in order to facilitate those meetings. And basically they don't work, they work a lot better in person, personally, just because, you know, you can actually like, you know, stand next to somebody if you need them to be quiet or anything like that. But they still are actually really effective over Zoom. You know, you just really want to make sure that you get everyone bought into that process.
Are people finding that they're able to articulate their actual goals during this time? Or is there a lot of, well, depending on the pandemic?
I think we do get some of the depending on the pandemic. And, you know, early on in the pandemic, I think people wanted to be able to say, they wanted to be able to kind of articulate their goals as if it wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. And then later come back to say, well, this is real, this is happening, and it's going to be around for a while, right? So, I mean, I think it depends on the team, and it really depends on what your strategy is and whether it's affected by the pandemic. But I think that reevaluating your goals when circumstances change, and that's actually something I'm going to talk about later, is what is the process for all this and how does this actually fit into our product development lifecycle?
Yeah, and then one more question we've gotten is, how is this different? So these goal alignment workshops where you're coming out with strategy how does it differ from actual strategy consulting, thinking Bain or BCG?
I think we're a lot more focused on I can't speak to the way that those kinds of companies would do kind of some kind of strategy alignment. Our focus is not to come up with the best company strategy in the world that is, you know, untouchable. It's really just to come up with something for this part of the process, because it's iterative. You're constantly reevaluating the goals, and it's not about, I always say that design thinking and this kind of strategy is not about being right. It's about setting the right direction. And that's really the important part. It's not about having an ironclad strategy. It's about having a strategy that helps us set direction. And I'll talk about that here in a second too.
And I'll say, having seen both of those things, strategy consulting firms and your approach is, the idea is it's not set in stone. This is changeable, but this is something that we're going to take steps towards. Whereas when you see one of those big strategy consulting companies leave, they're leaving you with a binder and they say, good luck, and there's no road to implementation. So I would say there's a lot of, you come up with a lot of roads to implementation, how we're going to get this done, what iterative development steps we're going to be taking. So,
right. It's about making something that's actionable. So Dr. Simmons, who did that project, that experiment, says, looking isn't the same as seeing. We have to focus attention on something in order to become aware of it. And he goes on to say that the failure to notice people in gorilla suits is actually just a natural product of something we do well, which is, and important to us, which is focus our attention. And we need to be able to filter distractions in our world in order to do the tasks we're trying to do, which has an implication not only on user experience, but also our goals. And we don't have an unlimited amount of attention to devote to other things. And we only see the things that we focus our attention on. So really, like, what am I trying to say with all this, right? And I'm trying to bring it together to say that without shared goals, we don't know where to put our attention. We aren't aligned on what matters, and we can't distinguish between obstacles and opportunities, which is really important. Even worse, if everyone has different goals, then what you end up seeing is everybody pulling in different directions, and we all go nowhere, or just we go somewhere really slowly, but that's very unclear. And I think this is something Scott and Lance said the other day, is framing problems or questions affect everything. And so the typical response I've seen to that problem is more pressure on product teams to deliver faster. It's like, well, we're not delivering anything, faster, 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 faster. And the actual problem is something I call alignment churn. When you can't get aligned, you're not going to get the right problem solved to move the needle for the business. And that, in fact, is the largest operational obstacle that everyone is dealing with. So to kind of give some weight to what I'm talking about, in 2015, there was this paper published by the IEEE called Why Software Projects Failed. And they estimated that $1 trillion a year was spent on IT software projects. And that number since then has probably only gone up. Of which those projects, 15% are abandoned. And they estimate that these projects make up for around 5% of company revenue. Of the work done by development, they estimate that 50% is avoidable rework. And that rework costs 100 times more to fix after the fact. This might be things like, having to change architecture, for instance. So the contributing factors cited were things like unrealistic, unarticulated project goals, poorly defined requirements, poor communication between stakeholders, development, users, stakeholder politics, right? And I imagine a lot of you are experiencing these things. We actually have a poll about this. So, which of these issues, do you find yourself dealing with? And I think you can actually multi-select on this one, right, Krista?
Yeah, this is a multi-select poll because I have, different organizations that I've been in, I would select multiple of these. Even organizations that I volunteer with, like, you can see these kinds of problems. So go ahead and roll about 5 more seconds on this.
Okay, let me This is blocking my presenter's view. Here we go. So because of this, I basically say for teams that are dissatisfied with long development cycles, projects that aren't adding business value, circular discussions, or simply tired of playing it safe and not actually innovating their business, I say this is why you need UX. Okay, it looks like the poll is done. Awesome. Yeah, okay, so like most people are dealing with this. Right, okay, so, say what?
It's pretty across the board, but of course, poor communication between stakeholders, development, and users is going to be number one.
Right, definitely. So in a report commissioned by IBM, they asked Forrester to measure the impact of their design thinking program. And initiatives. And for those of you who know, who don't know about this, IBM basically spent a lot of effort planting designers in all corners of their business for years now. And what they found is that IBM achieved a return on its investment by 301%, which I think is amazing. They say that they saved 20.6 million with accelerated projects. They say that 18.6 million increase in portfolio profitability. They claim that they were able to deliver to the market twice as fast. They reduced design time, and design time can be considered as, you know, getting requirements, figuring out what the actual solutions can be, by 75%. You know, this has to do with that churn that we talked about. Reduced development time by 33%, and in total have experienced a benefit of $48.8 million. And I think that that's a big deal. I mean, that's a company the size of IBM, but that's still a lot of money. And so qualitatively, the impact you can see directly correlates to our contributing factors. And we can talk about the ways UX helps with this, but empowered, engaged, happy workforce, right? Improved collaboration and business strategy. Employees think creatively without fear, stakeholder buy-in, departmental alignment. This is like this is the kind of benefit that we see. And so, I know that was like a bit of a detour, but it's an important one, I think. And I just believe that we need to shift our thinking about goals and not groan when, there's somebody who asks, well, what's the goal here? We need to focus less on actually hitting the goals and more on their utility for setting direction. So in the case of that reservation management system that I was talking about earlier, we did a goal alignment workshops and we produced much higher goals than we had before, as you can see. So original goal, replace the legacy software. The 3 highest priority goals that came out of that alignment workshop were reduce call handle time by 15% while maintaining service levels, reduce reliance on partners by 20% while maintaining our increasing revenue, and reduce system training time by half. That is something I can work with. These goals then became the lens we use to focus our attention on what actually matters from our research. And additionally, this kind of goal creation creates accountability that now we have to measure the outcomes to determine whether or not what we built is going to help us meet our goals. So we're going to send out a poll here about how confident do you feel in your product and design development process. So while we're doing that, I'm going to say that the next most important ingredient of a successful product design is buy-in on process, and not just any process, an effective process. An effective process in our point of view, it has a bias towards action. It invites experimentation. It optimizes for shared learning, and it favors evidence over opinions, right? So this goes back to using data. And we don't say facts because there are no facts. There's really just evidence to support, it's a strong inference towards what we want. All right, so I'll move on here. And so,
the overwhelming majority here is, or not overwhelming, but a majority of people they have some practice, but not enough. Second place is they're on the path, but they have some work to do. Very few people have seen the light, so.
I want to know who those people are. All right, great. So this is awesome. Here we go. Okay, and so You know how much we love process at BP3, and we have a process to the process, right? So how about that? We have a proven and repeatable problem-solving protocol in order to get our designs. This is the way we work to design successful products, and it's something like this. Our process, like I talked about in design thinking, is not always the same, right? Sometimes it depends on what you learn. In this first section, we do what we already talked about, right? We align on strategy and product and business goals. Next, we do discovery. Now, using a multidisciplinary approach, we do research by basically casting a wide net to understand the problem space and kind of explore all the dark corners. But while we're doing that, we're using our product goals that we discovered in that first section as the lens by which we can identify opportunities to lead inquiry. There's a lot of ways that this could go. I believe you've heard people talking about process mining this week. That's one method, right? So getting data doing a data analysis in conjunction with process diagrams and journey maps could be one way of finding opportunities. Using what we learn, we define UX goals and form hypotheses on how we can move our product and business goals. Then we iterate on designs. This is actually where we start creating stuff, creating ways to test our ideas until we arrive at a solution that we feel confident can affect the change that we're looking to make. And I should add that during this design process, for us, because we're working with operational systems, right? Sometimes there's some architecture that there's a very heavy investment in and that cannot be replaced, right? There is this very tight relationship with development, and usually with an architect or someone of that nature, in order to ensure that what is being designed is actually feasible and can be built, or within a reasonable time frame, for instance. From there, the designs are handed to development, shown here as a black box. And in my view, because if we have an agile process, there shouldn't be any codependency between our process over our processes for design and development, other than to have a full backlog. And then when something gets released, here you can see measure. It's measured, right? The impact of what we delivered is measured, and that data feeds into another iteration of product development. And this is kind of like that follow-up that we talk about. This is the follow-up that leads to the more foresight, being able to get a better idea of what we need to do for our future, and better to take informed action with the right focus. So in this kind of process, we actually want to make the shift from thinking about requirements to talking about constraints. And the big key difference is being that when defining if we're not defining a solution in advance, right? Requirements are usually based on assumptions. One, those assumptions aren't always right. And two, they usually maintain the status quo, right? But instead, what we want to do is define guardrails, and what we definitely can't do through talking about constraints over requirements. And that kind of allows us to explore what's possible rather than re-inheriting issues. So an example is in this project I was working on, where the business defined a requirement of a legacy system the legacy system had a capability that when you uploaded a file, there was also a checkbox to be able to send that file to an accounting system. And when we interviewed users, they found that not a single user knew what that capability was. And when explained, they didn't even need to use it, right? So it's requirements. We don't want to re-inherit things that we don't need to build. That's more development time than we don't need. So anyways, in the case of the reservation management system that we were talking about, we used the articulated SMART goals to focus on what mattered. So during our research phase, we performed interviews and observational studies to understand what contributing factors were impeding the goals, right? So we knew what our goals were, and we were doing that research. So specifically call handle time and training. So during our research, we learned that most of the reason training took so long is because call center employees had to have a near encyclopedic knowledge of product and services in order to navigate parts of the system. And then, according to call center agents, the leading cause of call center call times was the result of customers having to wait while agents ran searches in the system. And it wasn't a performance problem, it was actually a process and UX problem. And so based on that, we formed hypotheses on designs we believed could resolve these issues and help us meet the goals of, and move our goals. So really the way you would expect the process to look like is more like this. This isn't an exact explanation, right? But the point is that we use what we learn from the outcomes to determine what the next right thing to do is for the business and the product. And ROI is going to be related to that measurement. If our goal is to reduce call handle time, well then we're going to measure call handle time, and how we measure that up against the goal is going to determine our ROI. The common problem I've seen is that clients think they can just start doing everything at once, right? Do all the things. And there's some kind of, discovery period where they often already defined what they want. This is kind of that requirements mentality. And then design and development begin to work in tandem. And the problem with that is that there usually isn't enough information to get started, and then development is waiting on design, and there ends up being this like requirements churn because we're still figuring things out as we go. And that can end up in rework for development and a whole slew of other problems. So the reason this works well with Agile is because we're focusing on solving smaller problems at a time. We're clarifying how those problems need to be solved well before development begins, and packaging that as incremental value so development doesn't have to figure that out, right? Development isn't responsible for figuring out anything. They get to focus on what they're good at, which is building reliable, maintainable, and high-performing software. I wanted to highlight also that aside from strategy and goals, UX helps create alignment through design artifacts. These are things that are used throughout the process. And things like workshops, right? Workshops help minimize discussion, right? They surface the best ideas, they eliminate the loudest voice in the room problem. That is a huge win. Wireframes, right? So being able to get some kind of representation of what that solution might look like gives stakeholders something concrete to react to instead of this oftentimes like very ethereal conversation up here. And when you're having those ethereal conversations, what I'm saying when I'm describing it might not match to what you're hearing and how you perceive it when you're hearing that, right? So it creates less mincing of meaning and better alignment. And then journey maps and personas, right? So those kinds of give us stories, stories that we can agree on like who are we talking about and what are their issues that they're facing. Because of this, I like to say that UX designers have learned how to UX the product development cycle in order to create better user experiences for product teams, right? So that's really important, is that process and that way that we build products also needs to be efficient. So anyways, the last thing that and it's the hardest one, like I talked about, is a supportive culture. And there isn't much more I can say about this topic, honestly, because it's a big topic on its own and it takes time to figure out. But really, we want to have a supportive culture that comes where we're valuing outcomes instead of outputs. Comfortable navigating uncertainty is a huge one. Growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and focused on delivering values for customers. So just another way of thinking about this is, what's the difference between a project and a product? Well, a project has outputs where a product has outcomes. Creating stuff versus, it's the difference between when you have a project, the goal of a project manager is to create stuff, right? It's more of this mercenary mindset of let's go in there, get it done, and then deliver, the outcome or the output, really. Whereas with products, where product managers are focused on, did I solve the problem? It's more missionary. It's more in service of the problem and based on some set of goals. So in order to talk kind of more about how these concepts kind of come together, I invited a good friend of mine, a senior UX designer at Essentia Health, Nick Loining, to talk to us about his experience growing UX and product development. Nick, you there?
I am.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So to kick it off, why don't you tell us a little bit about Essentia Health?
Yeah, Essentia Health is an integrated health system. We span across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota. We're made up of 14 hospitals, 70 clinics, 13 senior living facilities, and then a research institute. And we have 13,500 employees, and that includes more than 2,100 physicians and advanced practitioners.
Wow, okay, that sounds pretty sizable. And so tell us a little bit about your role at Essentia Health.
Yeah, I am the senior UX designer at Essentia, so really I am kind of that point of contact for any product requests, was really to start that process. I have a team of 3, which includes myself, a developer, and then a content specialist. And then effectively we just kind of, my role is to make sure that our goals are in alignment with our stakeholders. I go ahead and work on architecting the build plans, building the prototypes, doing research, then, also making sure that we're building some accessible products as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. That sounds like a lot of responsibilities.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. So through our own conversations, I know UX at Essentia Health has come a long way. Why don't you tell me about how you got started there at Essentia?
Yeah, well, when I first started working on 6 years ago, I was the Lone Ranger for the website. I oversee the website. And at the time, there was no UX. It was all basically designed by directive. So we just would meet with, clients and internal clients, and they would just tell us what they wanted, and we did it. And we tried to do our best to, think a little bit more audience-based, but at that time, it was really just go in, get the work done, and then get on our way. And then there was also one other FTE that was our digital marketing specialist at that time. So, in between then, our organization put forth a online patient experience initiative. With that came a new website build, some new roles, and as part of those new roles, the UX designer role came to be. And so that's when I got the opportunity to take on that role. And to me, coming from, web design and front-end development, kind of doing that design by directive for the first front of my career, then rolling into that web admin role where you're getting more of that holistic view of like websites, performance data, the analytics, and then just more of those load times, all sorts of things. It's like, it really just, I think, made sense to really step into that role. And of course, once you step into UX, which by the way, is way harder than it sounded at the time. You really, once you open that door and you just want to answer all the questions why, there's really no turning back for me. So, and I think as we kind of started to expand that role, we were able to, as part of this online patient experience initiative, we ran our first moderated usability study. And so for the first time, we brought 40 users in to test the primary features and the navigability, I guess I would say, of our primary features on the new website, and started really doing some of that guerrilla style research as well. Yeah, and then so that leads really to where we are now. After 3 years of doing this. Again, I'd mentioned we have a team of 3, myself, a developer, and a content specialist. And so UX is really starting to be built into everything that we do, that design process. We're moving toward executing up to 24 user studies this fiscal. And really, honestly, just everything that we've done, that we do now, is part of that more user-centric approach. We're using data to drive our design, our process, and really just try to get better results, really, with what we're going after, and be more efficient about it.
That sounds awesome. So a lot more user focused. So what kind of factors do you credit with growing UX?
I would say, as far as goal orientation, I would say, is probably the number one. As you just talked about, goal orientation is the number one factor, I think, as part of growing UX with Essentia Health here. I found that when we meet with clients, as you've covered a lot of, if you're not in alignment, your whole entire process moving forward is basically disrupted, right? You just maximize, or not really maximize, but you have a higher probability of running into risk when you're going through and completing the process. If you have curveballs thrown at you, which they always do get thrown at you after your initial scoping, you really aren't prepared to be able to handle some of those things and think through them thoughtfully. So I think goal orientation is a big thing, but I also think too, as far as like expanding UX, being able to connect with your internal clients, I think at more of a relatable level too. So when we talk about evangelizing and really expanding the UX footprint, I think when you first meet with clients and other stakeholders, sometimes I think, when you look at the nuts and bolts of UX, it can get kind of pretentious sometimes when you talk about like mental models and spatial memory and all these sort of things, right? And so, I think the biggest part of that is really just getting to their level and just talking, really explaining like what that impact is. Like, what does the UX mean to what we're trying to do? Why are we goal orienting, right? Why are we doing the things that we're doing? It's not really just about holding up the process or design control or anything like that. It's really about improving the product that we're going after.
Right.
And so I think that's that really other big part of it is just being able to connect with UX, your stakeholders, right? Look at your audience, I think, and learn how to connect with them to really help continue and evangelize that. And then as you go through, they can see those results as you go through that process. They can see what the goal orientation did for them. They can see why the product is better, and you can get your stakeholders to start actually looking through more of that user-centric lens as well.
That's awesome. And I think you're right about that. As I know in my own personal experiences, UX can kind of come off sounding like a little pretentious, right? Because, we want to sound, sometimes UX designers want to sound smart, right? And we want to be able to talk about, the reason we know why this works, but it's really, at the end of the day, it's about what's the outcome? What is this actually going to do for us?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So what would you say about, kind of having to convince people? Like, how do you convince people that UX is important? I think you said a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think, again, meeting with them at their level, but it's really the proof is in the pudding, right? It's like, you can, once you can kind of get them just to listen a little bit, it's like, you have to walk them through the process and kind of set expectations. I think that, making them feel comfortable with what you're doing is, obviously number one. But, I think, again, when you start at that goal orientation spot to help kind of start delivering and convincing, which I always say, the goal orientation, but it's so rudimentary that it's so easy to blow past. And really then, you set yourself up for trouble if you can't really prove that what we're trying to do is going to have impact. But, after you get through that goal orientation spot and you work through your activities to get everybody thinking in kind of that audience type lens, it goes on then to how you follow up in that process. And it's about being able to kind of report out on some of those results and using things like prototypes and those items to help kind of carry that message through as well, to say, hey, look, we started here with our goals and this big, huge, wave of ideas. We were able to really just hone in and say, what are our goals? What's our audience? What are our objectives? And start to really take this big cloud of an idea that, everybody's a part of and engaged on, and start to really materialize it. And then as you go through the process, you bring your stakeholders along with you. They can see it working as you go till you get to that product. And what we have found is more often than not, going through this process, that we come up with, a concept and a prototype, and everybody is like, this is along the lines of what we're thinking. There might be some tweaks or anything like that, but it's like, it just shows like we don't have any more. We don't have 4 meetings to sit down and figure out what we're trying to do just for that first phase. Like, it starts to show from like just an internal time standpoint, how much less time it takes, and really it's just more efficient engagement with everybody.
That's awesome. That's great. And so, what kind of impact have you seen UX make at Essentia Health?
Oh, I mean, the quality of our ideas that have come out between, when you can't have research at around every corner to use, when we do start generating ideas or concepts, the quality of ideas, and just really, again, through the lens of a patient for our cases, they're just much better. They're more honed in by the end of those activities. It's not so much of a having to chase people down or rein people in so much anymore. I think that when you're going through, from goal orientation to those activities you use to generate content or to generate ideas, I always say I get this proud dad moment, because, you have a varying number of stakeholders who work in various at various levels within the organization. And so, you know, you go through that process and you have all these ideas going and you have new concepts come up while you're generating ideas, but you'll finally hear, you know, one of the stakeholders say, hey, you know, we have this idea and we're talking a lot about this, but does this still fit our goal? And it's like, right. Yes, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, you don't, like when you're facilitating these things, you don't have to feel like you're like nudging people, you know, like you just see it happen in front of you. So you get this proud dad moment, like, yes, they, you know, they're getting it, the philosophy, the thought behind it, and the way we want to think about our products and what we're trying to do here. It's really taking.
That's awesome. And do you have an example of how, what kind of impact that's made, not only for patients, but for kind of like operationally or development?
Yeah. I, you know, when we were recently working on a specific toolkit around COVID, and you know, we were going through, and I mean, it's one of those things where when you have such a small turnaround time, because you know, COVID hits, and it's like, you know, we have to serve our patients, and we have to be able to give information when they need it. You know, I think an example of really when that process I've been able to see it work was really how fast we were able to knock out, you know, ideas that weren't part of it, or that were getting out of scope, or that were, you know, the scope was getting way too wide. How quickly we were able to turn that around, saying, hey, look, you know, our goal is to make sure that we're putting up, you know, digital products for a certain specific audience. Like, you know, let's keep focused. And we had a turnaround time of like, I don't know, it was like 3 days for this product. So it was, I mean, it was fantastic. And it was just really, you know, the ideas, all of them that were coming out were all specific and related to the goal that we were trying to accomplish. So, you know, that was awesome. And I mean, then on the flip side of it too, you have that better experience for the patients, right? So all this thought that we are putting into it, all this work that we're putting into it, you're getting good feedback for what's, you know, how the product's being used. It's more direct. So, you know, you're able to really complete both, you know, the goals internally to keep processes more efficient, but also externally really put out a product that's usable, and makes an impact for your audience. So, yeah.
And so I guess in closing, like, what would you say is like the biggest takeaway for you? Like, what's the most important part of your product development process?
You know, I'm going to have to go back to really, again, just goal orientation and setting the tone there. I think, you know, if you can get, you know, your goals and then, you know, your audiences and your objectives all aligned throughout your entire team, your development team, your stakeholders, you really mitigate the chance for risk. I mean, it gets to the point, you know, it's really where we can go ahead and land anything, because when we are in our meetings, like our developer and content, like specialists, they're not in these meetings when we initially meet, right? We have a very small team. They have to be doing work. So the most important thing we can do is get that alignment. So when I walk out of that meeting, I can perfectly articulate what it is we're trying to do, and they can get going, and, you know, we can get to it. And the same thing on, you know, on their side of the ball for the stakeholders, everybody's going to know what we're doing, so they can go walk away from that meeting and be able to articulate that to who they need to articulate it to. And so by the time you get to the end of it, it's, you know, we get back and there's very minimal change.
Focused. Awesome. Dude, Nick, thank you so much. Do we have any questions for Nick, or?
Yeah, we do. So we actually got one that maybe, Nick, you can answer for specifically Essentia Health. Where does the UX team normally sit in the organization? Is it a part of the organization, or is it somewhere else? Is it part of IT? Is it part of, where do you sit in Essentia Health?
So we sit within the marketing communications department, and we're kind of like our own little hub, the digital marketing team. So that's where we sit, yeah.
So we had another comment, and I guess, Nick, I'd like to get your kind of feedback on this. Mm-hmm. Is one of the comments was, when people are building back-end systems, how important it is to have a UX and UI experience, so that, you know, the UX designers understand the back-end and understand how it works. Do you guys do that at Essentia Health? Is that how it works? Do you get to see the back-end planning process so that you have an understanding of the problems and when you're setting up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also critical. You know, for what I do, I'm very blessed. First of all, to have, you know, the leadership I have that very much supports what we do. But I'm tied, basically myself and our developer are tied to the hip. Like, you know, I'll go through and, you know, being that I used to do development, I have a little bit of a leg up because I understand the architecture of our site. I understand the back end working. So usually, unless I'm hit at a very advanced concept, like I can help make some of those decisions up front. It's like, oh yeah, I know our system can do this, or that they can't. But when it gets into the weeds, I'm always basically talking to our developer anyway. I like to keep them up to speed as we go because, you know, it's like you don't want to make any assumptions either. So you don't want to throw any. So whenever I come up with my concept, he's the first person I check with. I'm like, hey, this is what I'm going for. You know, this is what I'm thinking the data could pull from to make your guys' life easier when we have to do updates. Like, what do you think? And he'll go through and be like, well, here's what I think the risk could be, or here, no, this looks great. You know, so we'll be able to address those things before I get to taking it to the stakeholders. The stakeholders see it, and as long as they sign off, we're pretty much off to the races, and a lot of that risk has already been assessed.
Well, those are it for the questions. I know we have some developers coming up shortly who will probably attest to how important it is that a designer understand the actual back end and the actual development side. So.
Right.
Thank you, Nick.
Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right. So now, before we talk with our engineers, I think I'd just like to bring some of what we talked about into perspective and talk about how it helps customers maximize return on investment. So, eliminating that alignment churn, right, is a big one, right? Because again, return on investment, is what's that investment? And part of that investment is all the time you spent making the thing, right? All the time you spent trying to get the outcome you're desiring. And that alignment churn that we talked about before is going to be a huge problem in order to minimize the amount of investment that you have to make, or at least being smart about that investment. So the way we do that is using that strategic mindset to connect business goals to product features, right? And that's done through something like a goal alignments workshop, or we could even do that depending on the size of the problem with a design sprint. Creating shared understanding with and language through design artifacts, like we talked about before, with personas, prototypes, and journey maps, right? So that allows us to all be talking about the same thing, and overcoming stakeholder politics and communication issues with things like design sprints, right? And so the benefits we see, and by resolving those alignment churns, we can increase value and sooner, right? So the product actually serves the business and generates value, right? To reduce design time, faster time to production, reduction in avoidable rework, like all the stuff that we already talked about. But in the instance of enterprise product design, the product itself is a tool that enables the business, right? So, and by designing better tools, we can increase the return we get on them at the same time, right? So the money and energy invested in ensuring we create the desired impact into our goals, but also the tool itself and the impact or the outcome, right? So improving the business outcome, which again comes back to the strategic mindset to connect business goals and product features through goal alignment workshops, right? Designing data-informed solutions by prototyping, testing designs before committing to build them. And continually measuring outcomes to inform the strategy and determine the goals, right? And so by resolving those kinds of issues and making sure that we're maximizing the impact of the product, we go back to our benefits of good user experience, right? So success for the business, fewer user errors, lower training and support costs, less rework for development, right? Higher employee retention. These are the kinds of things that we want our products to do for us. So now, in order to kind of get a different perspective, I'd like to welcome Brian Schlosser and Tracy Hires, both experienced engineers working in enterprise software development. Tracy, Brian, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Andy.
I'm glad you guys are here.
Thanks, Andy.
And so you both have experience working with design. Brian, let's start with you. So what kind of benefit have you seen for engineers when working closely with design?
Well, I think the biggest one is that there's less work for me to do, right? If I don't have a design team, right, some of that work's going to fall on me. It's nice to have their support, but it's also nice to, some of the things they do, things that I might typically not think about, while I think about engineering, it's nice to have the design team there to go off and, to do that user research and move stuff along, as well as, refining what the business's goals are, like you talked about before, so that I only have to build something once.
Okay, so kind of just allowing you to focus on building software, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Tracy, what about you? Like, what kind of value have you seen clients experience when working with a UX team?
I think a big thing that clients get value out of that they probably don't expect is they tend to get clarity about what they're doing and why. You mentioned earlier in your goals workshops how that comes about, but I think often directors of IT, even business stakeholders, know they need to do something, but they don't know what it is that they need to do. Through the workshops that you conduct and the user interviews and these types of things, sometimes these people that are running projects learn new things about their business. Even if they don't, even if they knew it, it really does help focus their attention and their effort.
Right. And I think you talked a little bit about that yesterday when you were talking about the cruise project we worked on together.
Yeah, we saw that.
Right. And so not every project gets to engage with the design team. So what kind of problems do you encounter, Brian, when design is not a part of the process?
Well, someone's like a theme I just mentioned last time I talked is, if there is no design, right, somebody has to do it, right? There's levels of which it gets done, but at some point, a lot of times it falls on the engineering team to do. And I've been doing UI development a long time, so maybe I have some good instincts about how screens should be designed, but I haven't been doing the workshops and those user studies. So, I do something, whether it's good or not is, to be debated. And, the analogy I was talking about the other day was, well, if you're looking for a good meal, yeah, you can go to one of your engineers and ask him to make you a good meal, but you'll probably have better success if you go to a chef.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Great. And then what about you, Tracy? What kind of problems have you encountered when design is not a part of that process?
So I'd echo what Brian just said. Somebody is going to design your system. And the question isn't, are you going to get a designed system? The question is who's going to design it? And I'll tell you a story. Several years ago, I was working with a biotech company that was bringing a new cancer treatment to market. And they brought us in to help them build a new system to schedule their manufacturing production. And we built something for them, and it was called, the name of the system that we built was called IntelliVenge. That's just how they branded it at the end of the day. It was a well-designed system that did exactly what it was. It was a well-built system that did exactly what it was designed to do. But the problem was, it was designed by two business people, a couple of consultants. I was one of the consultants, and a few senior people in their IT organization. We designed the system, we built it. It did exactly what we understood the requirements to be. We handed it off to them. We went away, we worked on other things. A few years later, we were called back in to help them because what had happened was some staff at one of the plants had built, the system we built was called IntelliVenge. And on top of that, staff at the plant had built what they were calling Excelavenge, which was really an Excel spreadsheet, giant, messy thing that was built right on top of the system because the system, while it did what it was designed to do, it didn't do what the users needed. Again, you're going to get design. The question is, are you going to get the right design?
Right. Where is it going to come from?
Yeah.
Yeah. It really reminds me too of, something we've talked about before, Andy, that, I think it's fairly typical, at least for us to come in, we come in and we end up talking to the business, and it's usually business management about, okay, what do they need to get done? And a lot of times they want to tell you how the system should work. And you had a really, good observation and a way of articulating it that really caught it for me is, it's great that yes, those business users, a lot of times, they've been promoted from within and they've grown in the company and they understand what the job is that needs to be done. but they forget that they have a whole lot more context now.
Right.
And those people who are doing the job every day may not have that information. So it's really important to go and talk to the actual users that are going to be doing it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's gonna be colored differently. Mm-hmm. Different perspective, different angle. So how do you think UX helps with organizational obstacles, Brian?
When you're saying organizational obstacles, are you talking about the keeping the project on track and, you know, identifying what the goals are?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. You know, again, it's something you can ignore, right? Which I think is maybe a little bit of a theme that we talk about the whole time is you can ignore design and then something will happen. And, you know, some of the organizational alignment and stuff, I think that happens naturally out of doing the design. You know, you can ignore it and something will happen. So, you know, I think that design helps get in there and have those conversations so that you avoid some of those. It'll just figure itself out.
Right. What about you, Tracy? What have you seen? How have you seen UX help with organizational obstacles?
So I'll start with a story. A few years ago, I was part of a team that was brought in to sort of rescue a project. You had product owners writing requirements without much business or even technical input. And the development team in this case was really tripping over itself, trying to leverage the technical stack that was chosen by the architecture team, and by the way, kept changing over and over again in order to deliver on those requirements. It was a bit of a mess. The project wasn't delivering anything on really anything of value. So they brought several of us in to sort of right the ship. We made a bunch of recommendations. Among those recommendations, we said you've got to take a more holistic approach to your product ownership. You need to do design thinking. You need to a few other things that piece of advice we gave them, and really they said, "Oh, that's nice, but we don't want to do those things." We really figured out that we weren't going to be able to help this client. I'll tell you, last I heard, and I heard this not too long ago, that particular project, it's still going on. It's more than 2 years behind, tens of millions of dollars over budget. They just keep spending money and they're not getting much. We had another client who was in a similar kind of situation, missing dates. They're starting to lose, the business stakeholders are starting to lose faith in the dev team. But there they took our recommendations, and our design team, and Andy, you were part of this one. They began holding design thinking workshops, and we were able to pull them out. And what we saw was suddenly, as we started to engage with these workshops, we had business people engaged with IT people. We had good communication, and that faith was restored. And we started, we were able to eliminate some of the requirements churn and some of the dev churn. But really, the organizational obstacle was this faith and this lack of communication. And by bringing people together in focused workshops, we really started to make progress there.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, and I remember that, and I remember one of the obstacles was not getting access to users, right? And
oh yeah, that was huge. Right, you had product owners that were afraid to go to users because they didn't want to waste their time, and so they were just writing requirements without input as best they could, and these were subject matter experts that had come up through, but what they were doing was writing based on their memory of what they needed to do.
Right.
And, you know, businesses change. But you were able to help facilitate that communication with the users in a real way.
I think one more question. So for Brian, at what stage of a project have you seen customers get the most benefit out of design engagement?
Early, at the beginning, right?
Okay.
That's when you get the most benefit, because, you know, the last project we worked on, you know, you came in later after the business had, you know, kind of sketched out their requirements. And, you know, while you can look at that and go, okay, maybe that eliminated some work because you could, you know, get up to speed with all that thought that had already been put in. But at some point too, it means you have to go backwards and understand all those decisions that were made before, and sometimes you have to correct them.
Right.
So, you know, earlier is better. Anytime is better than never.
Yeah. That's great. And I think in that project, I do remember, you know, we realized like some of the requirements weren't exactly 100% correct, or really it was, you know, the requirements themselves were really just like a finger in the air, right? The actual details were not there, right? So I think that project also, you know, had something similar to where it was, you know, it's a database with some screens. And, you know, but turns out, you know, I think we delivered over 20 mock-up screens that provided the level of detail that would allow them to see all the interactions and possibilities of, right.
Yeah, the other thing I think of too, though, is that, you know, I think some people get into the mindset of design is designing screens. That's just a little part of it, right? And that part of it actually can come a little bit later, but you can't think of, well, that's what design is, so I don't need to engage the design team. No, there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes into it. And it's also you guys getting up to speed so that when you do those designs of those screens, you know what you're doing.
Right. And that it's really, I can make a mock-up really quickly if I understand the problem thoroughly, and we have a really good model for how it should work already. That's great. So do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. First, we have a comment, Brian, to your example of the chef versus the engineer. To get a good meal, yes, go to a chef, but with design in mind, the chef should be asking the design elements to understand what kind of meal you want. Get a very descriptive of what kind of flavors, smells, other intangibles come that create a good meal for you, which I thought was a really important addition.
Yes. Yep, no, I agree.
So one of the questions, and I think Brian and Tracy, you guys both have really good insight into this, is when you're building applications with tools, for example, IBM BPM, with limitations on their UI and user experience, how do you create a position for a UX designer and really open up the aperture for them?
I have a thought on that one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and it goes right back to what I just previously said about you have to think of design as more than just the screens, right? Yes, being an IBM BPM, that does limit you to, you know, I'm following a process, right? So I have to think more in tasks. And it does put some constraints around the design, but there's still with that, you know, I think the design can still bring in a lot about, okay, I can go in there and, you know, if I'm using IBM BPM, I can make this code shoot and I can make it really complicated and I can put all kinds of data in there. But is that what the user really needs? And that's what the design, you know, regardless of what system you're going to try to put it in, you can think through those things of, okay, what really is the data that's needed? You know, putting more data on the screen is not a good thing, right? There are a few cases where a little bit more data will help you, but just putting it out there without thinking about it, you know, is not good. So there are constraints, and, you know, I think our design team does a good job with that. You know, we have that at the current customer, and it actually came up yesterday on one of the calls we had where we were talking about stories of, well, if this user does this, when they say, okay, I'm done, and it takes them to the next task in the process, well, the next task in the process is theirs. Sometimes. Right, and you have to do these, and, you know, Andy went through, and in this case, that, you know, had thought through some of those. Okay, well, maybe we can make an optimization in the process there and say, well, if you are the person and this data is already filled out, you know, we can skip that task and we'll just put a decision gateway there and route you around it.
Andy, how do you deal with these kind of constrained applications?
Embrace the constraint, right? You know, and I think that, again, this goes back to like the conversation of requirements versus constraints, right? You know, when, you know, Brian and I have been working on something where it's Camunda, right? Camunda is the process engine, and there is a process, and there's only so many things Camunda can do. And in fact, sometimes, sometimes Camunda and IBM BPM kind of blend to me in my mind because they're both BPM, right? So I'll go to Brian and be like, can't we do this? I think we can solve this problem by doing this. Can we do this? And he goes, that's actually an IBM BPM feature. We'd have to build that out in order to do that for Camunda, right? So then that constraint allows me to go back to the drawing board and say, how can I get the user what they need in order to do this job with the constraint of the system? And not only that, we've actually seen changes in the process because of UX, right? Going and discovering what actually needs to be done and saying, well, you know, based on the circumstances and the context of use and what this user is going to do, then this doesn't make sense anymore. What instead we need is a ad hoc step that this person can initiate, and then this is how we would do that, right? So there can, you know, it's using the constraints of the system, and I think that's a big principle at BP3, especially because, you know, most of our customers are enterprise level customers who already have such deep investments in the technology that they're using. So, you know, changing the architecture is not really a choice. But leveraging it is really what we want to do.
So then we have another question, which was, can you talk about how UX culture can work with Lean and Six Sigma groups? And I think that one's kind of hard, but maybe Andy, Brian, Tracy, feel free to dig in there, because I think we see a lot of Lean and Six Sigma through these process cultures, and then bringing in somebody like Andy, you know, maybe that's oil and water, but Andy, what are you seeing?
Honestly, I think they're all the same.
Careful, that's fighting words for the Six Sigma black belts out here.
I actually think they all play together really well. And for me, it's about just changing your mindset from, you know, it's kind of like what I talked about in that growth section. It's changing your mindset from we have the answers to a growth mindset of we can find the answers, right? And I think you can find, you know, like in a Lean Six Sigma mentality, you can find operational inefficiencies and deal with them. But, you know, at the same, you know, I think you still need to figure out what your goals are, right? And your goals are really going to prioritize where you put your dollars and your energy, right? So yeah, we have an inefficiency over here, but, you know, this one over here, you know, is going to, fixing this one over here is going to save us, you know, $1 billion, which is this one is only going to save us 250 million, right? I don't know. And I do think that it's really just about changing your mindset from to being more experimental and allowing answers to come and to learn, instead of just already having a set on your mind made up on how everything should be. And the only reason I say that is because, you know, really what our customers are wanting is competitive differentiation and innovation for their business, so then they could like respond to the market a lot faster. But you don't get that if you're just having this fixed mindset and just continuing to do the same thing over and over again.
I'd just add, I think that systems are a combination of people, processes, and technology. And I think that Lean and Six Sigma are really focused on that second thing, processes, right? How can I make my process the most efficient and squeeze every little last efficiency out of that process? And that's good. But that's one piece of your system. So, and UX really is a little bit more focused on the people. And I think that there are ways to complement each other within those disciplines. They're a little bit different, but there's no reason why they have to be at odds or in competition with each other.
And I'll add that, like, you know, whenever your mindset is to squeeze what you can out of a process, the failure mode there, to use somebody else's words, is assuming that your process is the right process, And that's where a UX mentality comes in, is what is the right process that's going to support the outcome we want, and then redesigning for that process, and then you can use those kinds of principles. And for instance, design sprints are considered a design thinking lean methodology, right? And it's because really it's a rule that I abide by is, the 80-20 rule is focusing on how we're going to get the best outcome with the least amount of investment and moving forward. So then that way we can always make steps towards improvement rather than thinking that we need to have these big bang solutions or these big bang answers. It's not. It's what's the next right thing to do, and to give us the best outcome, and doing that in steps. And the mentality being, we're always just taking steps. It's the same process every day. Same process. What do I need to do next? What do I need to do next? What do I need to do next? And knowing what those things are based on where you are now, but not trying to just say, okay, now I need to you're not taking leaps. Leaps aren't gonna get you where you need to be, I don't think.
Yeah. So there's some good conversation happening over on the Slack organization around constrained design and how we finally reprogrammed Andy's brain to use Six Sigma terms like failure modes. So if you want to, I placed the link in the chat. You can head over to the Slack organization and join the conversation over on day 5 user experience design.
Awesome. Well, I only have a few more slides. I don't know if we have any more questions, but really I think I just want to leave with this is, I think similar to a tree falling in the woods, right? If a product is built using really a lot of fancy technologies, and fancy is maybe not even the word, but and no one wants to use it, it's not aligned with your business, does anyone care? It doesn't matter. And my interjection would be, and not to be a jerk, of course, this is really just to take the piss out of all my really smart cohorts who are engineers. But we really want to create things that are valuable, and that people care about, and that and we want to do it with maximum alignment and buy-in. So that original investment is a smart one, right? We're being very smart about how we invest our time and our energy. So I don't know if there's any other questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah. So the first question we have is, is Net Promoter Score part of the design process, or is that something that you would not really take into account?
Man, I think Net Promoter Score is an interesting one. I mean, I think there's a lot of data from different organizations. I think Nielsen Norman might be one where Net Promoter Score, depending on context, is not necessarily even a great measurement of success. So I think it really depends, and I think it just really depends on the goal and the outcome you're looking for, and sometimes it even depends on the functionality you're creating in order to create that impact. So maybe NPS isn't the correct measurement, maybe time on task or some other heuristic might be more important.
So what are those heuristics that people might look for and be conscious of when they're thinking about user experience? And, is my user experience bad? This is a number that might point to that.
Honestly, again, I think it would say it depends on the context of the solution, the outcome, and the goal. I think, so for the example that I gave about reducing call handle time, right? I mean, call handle time is the thing you're measuring, right? But that could also come across in a lot of ways. And we might also want to say, well, what are we spending our time on? I think that there's things like I said, time on task. That's one heuristic that you can measure. You can another one would be whether someone was successful or not. So actually measuring whether or not we deem the task that they're performing as a success, right? Were they able to find what they wanted to find? And then figuring out how that translates to our goal is going to be important. But I think it's always dependent on the context.
So another question is, as it relates to usability design, are you using things like A/B testing? And how do you make sure to get statistical significance there?
So I think you just have to have a large enough sample size, right? You want to make sure that your sample size is relevant. You know, I remember I heard one person say that 3 makes a pattern, but you know, I think that's when we're talking more like guerrilla UX. But I think whenever we're doing something that's, we do A/B testing, and I think A/B testing can be really important when you're having competing ideas. It's not a default strategy, A/B testing. But when we have something that we believe is working and we have a theory on maybe an alteration to it that might be useful, then yeah, maybe we can have something in production, for instance, where 50% of our traffic is diverted to a different solution. I think another strategy we would use rather than A/B testing is maybe smaller rollouts, to where we say, okay, you know, we did our usability testing with prototypes here. We feel more confident in this solution than the one we have, but you know, maybe we want to roll it out to this one part. So for instance, in the telecom example, it was 33 different management areas, right? So in that instance, rolling out a solution to one management area and testing the outcomes there that we're getting versus maybe a control group. And then statistical significance, I think for us would basically just be make sure we're getting enough data to be able to confidently say, we see a difference being made here and we feel confident in what it is. And some of that's qualitative, it's not always quantitative.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for being here today. We're running a little out of time here, but this has been such an energizing day. We've had a lot of questions that we didn't get to. So you can either contact Andy, or we're going to take them over into that Slack organization. The Slack organization link is in the chat. There's also a link to your Driven t-shirt, your free Driven t-shirt of turning coffee and tacos into process. So all of 2020 Driven will be available early next week on our YouTube channel. That's 5 days of content going live soon. So thank you again, Andy, and any last words?
I don't know. Yeah, yeah. No, I think just, you know, I think, you know, change in order to get new results. You got to change your way of thinking, and I really encourage everybody to you know, embrace failure, embrace learning, and try something new, and you know, embrace that discomfort.
Well, thank you, Andy, for making us all comfortable in our discomfort today. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Have a good one.